morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. As you said, we've been part of some of these initiatives over actually beyond the last year. So great to be back. And just to add to some of Justin's comments, I think what we've really enjoyed is, the variety of conversation and questions and engagement that we get. There's a very broad range of perspectives that you find in the community of people that join DLF, and it's always lovely to get those different perspectives. We have one view, but it's really nice to be challenged and to have different people's perspectives. So please do ask the questions. And hopefully this will be valuable. I've got 20 minutes or so and really just going to try and cover three things. AI is obviously a huge topic, and I know we're going to be coming back in future sessions. So really just three things I wanted to cover today. One of which is, what does artificial intelligence mean from kind of Intel's perspective? What are we doing to try and drive AI? How do we help AI be deployed at scale, which is something Intel does well with technology? And really, we're conscious that a lot of people, some of you may have worked with us before, but a lot of you may not. And so I just want to make it clear, how can you work with us and how can you use us when it comes to this topic? We really don't want the conversation to start and finish in this 20 minutes. We'll give you some information, but please want to encourage people to reach out, after this session is finished and really use us as you advance your AI journey. And really they want to do that by giving you some examples and some case studies that we've worked on in healthcare. Again, there's hundreds and hundreds to choose from, but we've tried to pick a few that we think are interesting, really for inspiration and ideas, and hopefully to give you ideas about how you might use AI. As I say, we'll come back in future sessions. We'll go into some of these in more detail. And if there's something you see here that you'd really like to see in more detail, please let us know, and we can try and shape future topics to make sure that we're meeting what you need. So really, just to start with, there's one or two small sentences that really sum up, our view of AI and that shapes everything we're doing in AI. And the first thing is that we think AI is going to infuse everything. So whether it's healthcare, finance, pick an industry, whether you're a consumer or a business person, AI is going to infuse everything. Some of that will be very obvious. Some of that will be completely invisible, but AI is going to be everywhere. And so what we're doing is putting AI capability everywhere that is possible for us to do. So when you look at some of our technologies and our products, everything is starting to become infused with AI, and everything we do is about enabling people to apply that technology to make AI better, faster, more secure, easier to deploy. What can we do to accelerate that adoption of AI and its infusion into everything? So this is really fundamental to everything we're doing. And there's really three key things that we're focused on. And I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on the technology today. We absolutely can do in future sessions. But there's really three things that we're focused on. One of which is, and I've highlighted this as 3 S's: standard, specialist, and software. The first thing we're doing is the belief that AI is going to be everywhere, is to try and make AI a workload that you don't need specialist equipment to do. There is a perception that AI requires very specialist technical hardware, and it's certainly true there are scenarios where that's useful. But our view is that for AI to be a ubiquitous technology that is everywhere, what can we do to enable, general purpose devices like the laptops we all carry with us, like the servers that run the cloud, and everything in between? How do we help those general purpose platforms really excel at doing AI workloads? That enables AI adoption at scale. It enables people to utilize the infrastructure they already have to do AI. It avoids things like the creation of data silos and infrastructure silos. If you're having to stand up new, platforms and new infrastructures to do a particular workload, that becomes very complex. So we think there's huge value in enabling people to do AI on very standard computing platforms, whether that be, as I said, a laptop, a server, or a mobile device. So that's really the kind of first thrust of what we're doing. The second is, undeniably, there are places where you do need something that's a little special and a little different to your kind of general purpose devices. Some workloads, some scenarios will demand something that isn't, a standard computing device. And some examples of that would include, examples where you're deploying in areas of very low power. If you've not got, mains power available and something is battery operated, or if you're needing something where the response time has to be very, very quick and very low latency, and example of that might be, the AI that activates brakes in a car, in an autonomous car. Clearly, the defining feature of that has to be its ability to react instantly rather than an indeterminate amount of time. So there are absolutely scenarios where, despite everything we're doing in general purpose computing, there are requirements for specialist devices. And so the second thrust of our approach is to provide a lot of that very specialist devices to support those cases that really need it. Again, we're not going to go into those examples today, but we can come back and talk about that at a later stage. And the third is all around software. So if you're spending any time in AI and machine learning, you'll be very aware that it's a very fluid environment. There's any number of software packages and tools and frameworks that are being used, and it's this stuff doesn't stand still. It's very fluid and it's always evolving. And as a result, that can be quite a complex area. So our third thrust is around how do we streamline and simplify development of AI through tools and through software. And some of the examples there could be, how do we help people develop software once that will deploy anywhere? We're talking about building up a portfolio of technologies from general purpose through to specialist. If we have to ask people developing AI to do it in 6 different ways, depending on which piece of technology they're going to use, that immediately goes against the grain of making it ubiquitous and available to everybody. So there are initiatives around giving people single cross-platform programming environments to help streamline that. There's initiatives around providing pre-trained AI models for common use cases, sample applications, auto-tuning of code and AI models. So there's a really big investment around the software piece, which really helps to tie together the two things that you see on the left-hand side. So these are very high level, just to give you an example of some of the things we're investing in to make that AI vision a reality. And in terms of what that means in terms of how you can use us. So obviously we're here today to talk to you and engage, but outside of this initiative, our motivation is really to help customers do great things with the technology that we provide. And that support can come through, very hands-on engagements, whether that be hardware and software expertise that we can apply and give you access to. And there's a couple of examples here, and we'll share these details afterwards from UK projects in particular, one in Wales with the NHS, a project called Aspire, which was to do with using AI to look at images of how tubes are inserted into patients to make sure they're correctly positioned, so that such as they're doing the job they're required to do and they're not causing issues. So very specific example, and we got extremely hands-on with that in terms of developing code and benchmarking and testing and optimizing to the point where this was a usable technology. Another example that you see on the bottom right-hand side, a company called CHI developed what they call a capsule endoscopy product, which is where this little pill that you see actually has cameras embedded into it, and a patient can swallow this pill, and as it passes through the body, it collects video images of the digestive tract and gives people the ability to see if there's anything untoward happening. And clearly that requires a lot of image processing and artificial intelligence to make sense of those images. And again, this is a project we got extremely hands-on with to help them get the most out of the technology that they're using. So very, very high level examples, we are in a position to get very hands-on with this technology if customers need us to help them. So to give you some more examples and kind of food for thought on some of the examples that we're currently getting a lot of interest in. And the first is something called federated learning. And I know I'm going to get one of my colleagues to come back and talk about this at a much deeper level later on in the academy. And federated learning is all around the concept of distributing the process of training. So when you get an AI model, you're developing an AI that's going to be able to make decisions or see patterns in data. There's a process of training that model to get it to the required level of accuracy. So whether that's identifying customers in a retail environment, or in the case of medical, it might be identifying MRI scans to identify when there's cancerous cells or things of that nature. Or in the case of the example here, this was actually around looking at fraud cases within healthcare insurance. So whatever the task is that you're training the AI to do, there is that process of training, and that training uses data and tweaks a model and gets a model to the point where it's sufficiently accurate. One of the challenges of that is obviously the more data you have, the more accurate a model can be. But particularly in healthcare, a lot of that data is in very disparate sites. It can be in different locations around the country or around the world. And oftentimes those are, they're obviously physically separate locations, so there's connectivity challenges sometimes, particularly with very large data, but there's often issues with confidentiality and privacy. Data is often not allowed to leave the site that it's on. So the idea of kind of bringing all that data together into one place to train a model is, not practical, and in some cases not legal or not permitted under regulations. Federated learning basically gives you the opportunity to take a model, distribute the model out to all of the sites that are participating. The model gets trained locally on the data that sits locally within those sites, and then only the differences to that model are then submitted back to a central site to be kind of all brought together and aggregated. So each individual site is doing its own training on its own data. The data never leaves the local sites, but the learnings from the data are transmitted back to a central site to be consolidated and then retransmitted back out again. And you have this continuous process of update where the model is continually tuned and optimized, using all the value that's in those buckets of data, but keeping that confidentiality, keeping that privacy. And this is a concept that's something being talked about in AI. And some of the technologies that Intel bring is a technology called SGX, which essentially allows you to wrap a lot of this in very secure enclaves, as we call them, which basically means the model is protected as it's transmitted. There's no opportunity for that to be intercepted. There's no opportunity for the data to be breached. And it gives people that confidence to kind of wrap that process around in such a way that it's isolated and protected. And part of the reason we're so interested in the academy and working with companies like Pinsent Masons is there's always a technology angle and there's always a policy and confidentiality and ethical angle. And whilst these technologies don't solve those problems themselves, they give you the tools to apply to help you solve those issues. And so in the case of this customer here and many others, we're seeing them use SGX as a way to say, well, we can prove that these applications and these processes are being done in a way that is completely isolated such that no data is leaking. And it helps them kind of tick the box for the policy and the ethical and the regulatory requirements that they might have. The power of federated learning is obviously this is not something that happens at one site. This is something that happens at many sites. And what we're also seeing is some interest from companies who they may want to collaborate with their competitors because there's mutual benefit to sharing data and to making a globally better model, but they don't want to actually share their data. They want to share the insight from their data and get the insight from their partner's data, but they don't want to share the data itself. And techniques like federated learning allow you to do that. Technologies from us allow you to put an extra layer of protection over that such that you can demonstrate robustness. So federated learning is something we'll get one of my colleagues to come back and talk about a little more data in another session, if that's of interest. But in the meantime, I think we've made that case study available if people would like to read more about it. The second example is around language and speech. And obviously, we're all familiar with the kind of smart devices we have in our homes that will respond to our voice. I'm not going to say the name because she'll interrupt me. You will know who I'm talking about. But clearly, speech is a huge domain. And when it comes to areas like healthcare, but not exclusively healthcare, you get very domain-specific language. There's a lot of very generic language tools out there available for free, and they're good for consumer usage. But you find when you start to get into very domain-specific areas like finance and health, it becomes less accurate because they haven't been trained with that kind of very specialist language in mind. And so we're seeing, trends of companies who are in those very specific domain areas, taking capabilities that are available today for very generic language and retraining them for very domain-specific language. And in this case, we have a biopharmaceutical company that basically did this with two different use cases. They have a kind of a standard translation engine, and language translation is not a new thing. It's available to everybody through, Google or any number of other free services online, but they're not trained on medical language. So this company took, some of those standard models, retrained them for very medical and scientific specific language, and they now have this capability of supporting their nearly 50,000 employees with a service that will do very medical specific translation across 7 languages. They're doing like 10 translations a minute of these very complex documents and medical content. And the key point here is an example of where the engagement with Intel comes into play is by working with us, they've deployed this stuff on very standard infrastructure, and they've driven 5x better performance by working with us on optimizing that process that they have and that code that they have to make the best use of the technology that sits underneath it that comes from Intel. On the right-hand side is a similar capability, this one more around search. So obviously there's a huge amount of medical research and white papers and documents out there, and it's useful for people to be able to go and query those documents, but to do so in a kind of automated fashion. But again, they're very domain specific. The questions that are asked are very medical in nature, and the documents that they're having to go through are also very scientific in nature. So yes, there are capabilities to do this, but on kind of generic language. The ability to do this for domain specific cases is really valuable. And again, in this case, they're getting to the point of nearly 20 questions per second being asked across this company, across all their 7 languages. And again, nearly doubling the performance simply by, applying the right technologies and the right optimizations. And the key point is these optimizations can make the difference between, proof of concept getting beyond proof of concept or not. And so we encourage people to take advantage of the expertise we have on extracting the best value from the technology. So speech and language, another very strong example. The other is image and video. And I kind of put 3 categories here because it's tempting to think of when you get to medical, everyone kind of has the concept of, medical imaging, X-rays, MRIs, CAT scans, using an AI to kind of really supplement human decision-making in that process. The reason it's a really nice example is, as I mentioned before, whenever you talk about AI, invariably you get to the question that says, is this going to replace my job or is this going to get rid of humans? And this is a really nice example of where, absolutely far from the fact, this is supplementing the skills that are available, but often not available in sufficient volume. We've had examples working with companies in China where, for various reasons, they've seen a huge uptick in screening for things like thyroid cancer. But the big bottleneck is they just don't have enough radiologists to actually look at the scans at the volume they need to support this sudden uptick in people coming forward for scans. Training a radiologist isn't a 2-week thing, it's a multi-year thing. And so that ability to fill that or break that bottleneck lags. And so they've applied AI as a way to do some of that first stage diagnosis, which frees up some of the people who are in the loop and takes that bottleneck away. So it's a really nice example of kind of supplementing those human decision-making processes and helping with skills shortages, speeding up the throughput. And again, there's extensive examples of optimization success with Philips, with GE, with Siemens, a lot of companies in medical imaging. This is a very strong area. Elsewhere in kind of healthcare domain generally, obviously, given the last year that we've all lived through, social distancing's becoming an important thing. And we've seen a lot of people, not just in the healthcare space, but also in places like retail, looking at crowd monitoring and looking at whether you can identify, overcapacity in facilities or in retail outlets, other public spaces, looking at appropriate social distancing, looking at scans of temperature with thermal cameras, so a lot of this stuff around, not the classic healthcare model perhaps, but certainly benefiting public health. And so this has been a great example of AI deployed right out at the edge where people are meeting and having a positive impact on health. And finally, everything around sort of facial monitoring, facial interaction. The example I've given here is around a company that develops a system which will use facial expressions and translates those facial expressions into instructions for a motorized wheelchair. So not the immediate one you'd think of when you talk about facial recognition, but for people who are unable to move even just their hands to control a wheelchair with a joystick, this gives them the ability to have some element of independence because they can make facial gestures, and being able to accurately recognize those and translate them into an instruction for a motorized wheelchair obviously is hugely beneficial for somebody with that lack of mobility. Clearly there's lots of other examples of facial recognition as well, security and mood detection and so on. But it's a really big category itself, and again a really good example of where the defining feature in this case is obviously this has to be a mobile solution. This is not something you leave plugged into the mains. So this is an example of where power consumption really might define the technology that you choose to apply to solve this problem. So huge variety. Again, only so much time we have to go through some of these, but hopefully this is giving you some idea of at a high level of where we're seeing AI really make a difference. So really just to kind of summarize and finish off, as has been said, I think, healthcare undeniably is going to transform healthcare, but from both the perspective of patients and practitioners. So not just from one side, but across the whole spectrum. One size of AI doesn't fit all. It's a hugely varied domain, lots of technologies available, and really would encourage you, use the capabilities Intel has to help you as you explore how to solve your problems with AI. It's a huge domain. We do have expertise in that space. This hopefully is the first part of the discussion, but encourage you to come and utilize us. That's what we're here for.